talking about the babe and medical. At times there were no doctor in town. Usually there was a military doctor or a doctor at the Marine Hospital. But they had no particular training for children and no medicine and no antibiotics. So it was a hit and miss. And of course, when you read any statistics, the highest mortality rate is in those days is usually 0 to 10 years old. A lot of stillbirths, births afterwards. And this babe, or Lucia, couldn't get any milk. Her mother didn't have any milk. He went to see Uncle Sandy Cornish, try to get a goat to get milk. Sandy didn't have one. He sent to Havana to buy a goat and got a goat, but never had successful milk from that goat. He finally found the wet nurse, which was a woman who had had a baby that could feed this baby, or feed his baby. But he did treat him, and the doctors, the one incident, everybody's, the baby was having trouble and so forth, and he gave the baby Laudrium. Well, Laudrium was a common medicine in those days, particularly a pain reliever. Basically, it was opium mixed into alcohol, and so it definitely relieved your pain. So he gave the babe a little bit of Laudrium, and it slept all night and didn't move, and you could see why. But you could buy all these medicines over the counter, no restrictions on them. You could buy the opium or anything. So he did all sorts of treatments, and some of them I'm not sure. We looked up some of them. He also became a practitioner of the water medicine. It was called hydro medicine, and which water was used for all treatments. They put a wet cloth on you if you had a sore throat. If you got a cough, put a wet cloth on the chest, and they give them enemas of water and so forth. It was all based on water. So he became a practitioner of that. We even have a copy of one of the manuals that, and the doctor, one of the doctors happened to pass through Key West, and he talked to him one time. So, but it was a continual problem of medicine, medical treatment. That we have common things on our shelf today. Aspirin, they didn't have aspirin in those days. And any of the medication like we have, Mercurochrome or stuff just to put on a scratch or a hurt. So, and it included, he always had pets, had a number of dogs, but he had fleas and ticks. It was always a problem. He sent one dog to sea to try to get rid of the fleas and ticks. And the dog got messed up in ships and ended up in, I think, New Orleans. I don't think it ever got back home. But he had one here, so he found he had some arsenic, and he put arsenic on the dog and rubbed it down, and he said it killed all the fleas and ticks, but the dog got to acting peculiar after that. So, but evidently it didn't kill the dog. One of the things that's in this part of the diary we talked about, he gets involved in raising hemp. It's not hemp, it's the Mexican version of hemp. It's the Mexican bayonet or bayonet plant. And it has a big fat leaf on it. And he was trying to take the fiber out of that and to make rope. They do it in Mexico. And in fact, Dr. Perrine had brought the plant to South Florida because there was such great demand for ropes in those days for all the sailing ships and everything. So there was money to be made, and the Mexicans make a number of things, but not good rope from it. But anyway, he was trying, and him and Sandy Cornish both were trying. And he spends a lot of time talking about trying to get the fibers out of these plants to make rope in his diary, which was unsuccessful. And he just drops it. He doesn't say anything more about it when it's unsuccessful, as he often did when things didn't work out. He didn't give us any detail. But he did do the work in the courthouse, and a good view of wrecking. He talks to wrecking captains, the crews, and a lot of that in the diary. Anybody writing about the wrecking industry uses that his diary as one of the references. He was very successful financially and everything. From the wrecking court, made a lot of money, and he records it in there. And you got to put it in the context. At the time, the average working man was lucky to make $1 a day, and he's making, plus his government salary. He gets a quarterly salary for a district attorney. He's also getting fees from wrecking and handling court cases and doing it. So he's doing very well. But he decides to leave Key West. And he don't really ever said why in his diary. But he had a falling out with the judge, Judge Marvin, who was the head of the wrecking court, over the way of handling, and particularly him handling cases that were before the court, I think, in his other cases. So they had a big argument, which he records in his diary. And he thought the wrecking was going to die, which it was, because the lighthouses were being built, and wrecking was not going to be the same as it had been. So he decides to move, and we don't know. And of course, he moves to Illinois. He tries to get a government appointment there. Actually, Senator Stephen Mallory, who was from Key West, who was a friend of his, and he worked with him and was his representative, and they both were here at times. He had asked him to get him an appointment of some government job in Illinois, which evidently didn't happen. So the diary ends there. Now, one of the things that we know, and we're still hoping for, and we're looking. I've been to Virginia a couple times looking for stuff about him, and in fact had to plan to more or less go this summer, but that fell through, of course, with the virus thing. He regularly wrote his mother letters, and she was a prominent lady, and she did divorce her husband after they got back because of his Spanish girlfriend. And anyway, he ends up buried in Norfolk, her husband. She ends up buried in Richmond, Virginia. I just found that out here about 6-8 months ago, where she was buried. Been looking for her for several years. I thought she was in Monticello, but I couldn't find her. But anyway, we found her in Richmond. But he wrote her these letters. Almost every month he'd write a letter. So he's got to tell her something of what's going on. So we're hoping. We found some of her letters between her and her sisters and her family, but we haven't found her letters from him. But she was in prominent family in Virginia, and her daughter got married and moved to Philadelphia. She spent time in Philadelphia and was associated with Ben Franklin's family descendants in Philadelphia. So all these people saved all their letters. So hopefully somewhere in one of those mini archives in Virginia. And we've looked at Monticello some, and now more and more things are coming online. The Library of Virginia in Richmond has a huge collection of material. And I've been there twice, but they're getting more of it digitized and put online. So hopefully there's more Hackley stuff coming. But we did find more later on. So he leaves here, and it's interesting, he never, in his diary, talks about slavery. the slavery issue, which was a burning issue at the time. At one point, he acquires a slave, young boy, through a trade of some property. I think where he sold the land where he was growing his hemp or sisal hemp. And this young boy is caught stealing from a woman. And he is required as the owner to beat the boy. And that was by law. And evidently he couldn't do it. He hired the sheriff to administer the beating to the boy. That's reading between the lines in the diary and everything I know about him. And of course he gets rid of the boy, and nothing's ever said about him again. So we don't know. Being a Virginian, you'd think he might be. But anyway, he went to Illinois. And he took no part in the Civil War that we can find in Illinois. So after the war ends, he's hired by the federal government to go south to Tennessee to run down all this government cotton. The government confiscated all the cotton that was left at the end of the war. And it was because of the embargo and the blockade, there was cotton all throughout, particularly along the Mississippi River. And he's there working in the western Tennessee, looking and confiscating the government cotton, and he dies there. And he's buried originally in Tennessee. But we got some letters he wrote, Matilda, while he's doing this. So those survive. There's family members. I've talked to a number of surviving family members. He's buried in Tennessee, and during this time, Matilda has migrated to Pensacola. And they were going to bring him back and bury him in Pensacola. And somewhere his body got lost between Tennessee and Pensacola. And evidently they paid an undertaker. But anyway, so he ends up buried in unknown places somewhere between Memphis, Tennessee, and Pensacola, Florida. So that ends his quick story of his life. But I was always a fan of late Paul Harvey, who used to had a history program. I don't have the great voice that Paul Harvey had on the radio, but at the end of it, he would always have the rest of the story. So after the commercial, Michael wants to put a commercial in, now it's the time, he would come back and he'd give you the rest of the story. Well, the rest of the story turns out to be Matilda. As I mentioned earlier, the hospital here was the U.S. Marine Service Hospital. It was for merchant marines, and they paid a small tax every month to have these hospitals at the various major ports in the United States, and there was one here. The hospital service becomes the U.S. Public Health Service later on, but we had one here. Of course, all the patients are males. All the staff and doctors are all males. But in 1870, Matilda ends up as the matron of the Marine Hospital in 1870. And she's back in Key West. Of course, her sister's still here. But she got and it was a political appointment, and it was a paid job, which was rare for a woman to have a paid job in 1870. So anyway, Matilda ended up back here in Key West. I don't know how long she stayed. She ended up going back to Pensacola where her daughters were living, and she died in Pensacola in 1902 and is buried in Pensacola. So that's the story of William Hackley and the rest of the story.